Thanks very much, everybody. It's brilliant to see you here, and I hope everyone can see my screen okay. I'm going to put it onto slideshow straight away. Okay, good. So I am Sharon Clancy, obviously, and I'm delighted you're here today to hear this presentation. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the origins of the thesis itself. So the book, clearly, that I'm going to come on to later, emanated from my thesis, which was called, and this was John and Sarah and others who configured the original thesis outline, Adult Education, Spirit and the New Age, Sir George Trevelyan and the Shropshire Adult Education College, or SAEC, at Attingham from 1948 to 1976. And this was the focus title of my thesis. It's unusual for, in some ways, as John's already alluded to, because this was a collaborative doctoral award, and it was also a scoped PhD, in the sense that the parameters, the title and the focus to some degree were established before I began the work on the research. Obviously then, though, as the researcher myself, how I chose to interpret it and undertake it was pretty much to be established by myself. And I undertook the research between 2014 and 2017. This was the result of a huge trawl through quite a lot of catalogue materials, archive materials, existing recordings, for example, oral history recordings from the 1980s and the early 2000s, fantastic scrapbook materials with many, many photographs cataloguing college's activities between the 1940s and the 1970s, the boards of governor reports, the visitors' books, etc. And it was a partnership, as you know, between the University of Nottingham and the National Trust. And therefore I undertook, with a great credit given to the National Trust, much of my research actually took place at Attingham Park, and I was given space and opportunity to stay on site, which was a tremendous help to me, particularly as it would have been too costly probably to try and stay there in some other way. And so I undertook something like 40 plus interviews with former staff, students, Trevelyan's contacts and family members. And it became an extremely rich piece of research very quickly, very rapidly, right from the beginning of 2014. So why did I undertake it in this particular way? I felt it was really important that we saw this college as something that was not just a historical artifact enshrined in history, but that it was something that was about influencing and our understanding of the importance of residential education now. So I took the lens of George Ewart Evans, the famous oral historian, who talked about the importance of being a backwards traveller, using the past effectively to inform the present, but also to guide and influence the future. So I took both a historical and a sociological lens. It became very important to me to have a strong sense of both the time in which this college existed, that almost 30-year period between 48 and 76, and the spatial context, this stately home. And I rapidly realized that my focus, given my own origins and background, as someone who's particularly interested in working class history and education, was going to be what we really mean by notions of democracy, and with a particular emphasis on class and culture. And I took what we might call a life history rather than a life story type of approach in using oral history as my method. So very much the view, as Ivor Goodson stated, that there's something about life story that tends to individualize and personalize. And I was much more interested in the idea of life history and how that contextualizes, but also politicizes people's experience. So I took what we might call a narrative approach, very much interested in the ways in which people are enmeshed in and produce within social relations, but also taking the view that this thesis was important, this piece of research was important because of its important focus on a range of grand narratives at a time when we were becoming more atomized and much more focused on the individual. So I saw myself as primarily as a storyteller in many ways, trying to create a social, contextual, historical account. This is just some of a few images from the very early days of the college. So this is the women of the WI, in fact, who were helping the Times Women's Guild, I believe, get the college ready in its early days, whitewash, paint, etc. The image in the top is a group of women, a woman and some children at one of the very early courses, which were aimed at women, and particularly the articulate housewife. I will say more about this later. And clearly we have at the bottom a photograph of some of the staff. We have very clear differentiation there between the college entrance and the National Trust entrance. So there was always this relationship whereby the college existed literally alongside Lady Berwick, still living in the house. So we have this kind of very curious, almost cheek by jowl living arrangement right from the start. So if you like, the aristocracy are still part of the building, very much part of its experience, and were quite involved in certain ways, certainly in terms of the governance with the college itself. As I've said already, I had access to a huge range of materials and artifacts, many of which have now been digitized. So the scrapbooks, for example, which you see in the top left, we now have that digitized. The visitors' books, which were an incredible source of information about the speakers who attended, but also the students, and enabled me to do some forms of class-based analysis in terms of the profession and backgrounds of the students themselves and the range and breadth of speakers across a number of years. Finally, some of the artistic endeavours of the college, the mosaics, which are wonderful and are now in Wellington in the College of Arts and Technology, and the entranceway, which was painted with images from cave paintings. So this was an interdisciplinary study, very much so. And it was also about, it inevitably became not just about Attingham Park, but about the role of the warden, George Lothian Trevelyan, who later became a baronet in 1958, a complex figure. Some describe him as an educational pioneer, certainly a polymath with interests in numerous different areas and subjects which heavily influenced the college offer, and ultimately a charismatic new age leader. But these common centres or colleges of adult education were in every town across the UK. The notion of the idea of having a common centre was established in the 1920s. It was very much about aiming to foster alliances, collegiality between adult students, the wider community, and really to have its own social and intellectual life. So each college would have its very own specific identity, but with broad intent to democratise. And it was very important after the Second World War. What fascinated me from the start, that these were always, or very often, in stately homes and listed buildings, which had been the homes of the aristocracy and still were in the case of Attingham. And they were intended to promote this notion of moral, social and educational reconstruction amongst the wider electorate after particularly the impact of both the First and the Second World War, linking material developments and industry, the labour movement with spiritual health, citizenship and civilization. But these short-term colleges were distinct from the longer-term colleges. People may have heard of Ruskin College in Oxford, which would be much longer courses of 1 to 2 years. These were distinctly short-term in nature, weekends to 2 weeks in duration in terms of the length of the courses. And they had a tremendous amount of freedom in many, many ways. The Ministry of Education were quite happy for the colleges to work, as I've said already, very much in their own way, but as long as they maintained a focus on the practical as well as the theoretical. And as well as they were given remarkable freedom, the college's principals and tutors. They shared ideas, they worked closely with universities, local educational authorities, and the Workers' Educational Association, but each college distinctly ploughed its own furrow. So they were not typical in any real sense in terms of the detailed course delivery. Broad intention, yes, and the warden therefore had an enormous influence. They were fairly light touch in terms of the inspection and governance. There was a board of governors, and there was also an annual HM inspectors report. But this was only, if you like, once a year. There wasn't the kind of fear and anxiety attributable to perhaps Ofsted as we think of it today. There was a tremendous freedom. So what do we know about Sir George Trevelyan? A fascinating, complex man. Clearly he was, he deemed himself, in fact, Lord of Attingham at one point. He was, if you like, a dispossessed aristocrat. When he became baronet, he no longer had access to the family home, which was in Combo near Newcastle in the northeast, because his father, Sir Charles Trevelyan, gifted it to the country. So he, in effect, took on the role of the almost Lord of Attingham in his own right. So the college became far more to him than a job. It was an absolute part of his life and identity. And he also had the view very strongly that we were living in a classless society. I clearly beg to differ on this, but he did say these country houses have for the last centuries been centres of English society. And he's clear that the courses run in a modern adult college can be seen in some sense as carrying on the tradition of the English country house, but in a manner fitting for our more or less classless society. So the wardens, what do we know about them? I spoke with quite a number of former wardens, including Derek Tatton, who's here on this call, Walter Drews, who's the former principal of Wansford College. And you can see here that it did go to the head of quite a lot of the wardens. I love this quote from Walter Drews, this idea that they go around, and of course for some of them it went to their head. There was one of them who rode on his horse around the estate and said to the gardener, "My man." They behaved like squires. So this notion of a charismatic personality very much at the forefront of the college, but also an intense experience for the warden, very damaging in some ways, the amount of time, energy and commitment. And as Trevelyan himself discovered after 24 years, he said, "I had worn myself out and became so ill that I had to retire." So Trevelyan was a man of deep conviction. We know, I know way more about Trevelyan now than I ever did at the beginning. It's become an ongoing part of my own research and a growing interest. He became more and more a focus for my thesis, which was not the original intention. But I think that's because the college was clearly a place of experiment for Trevelyan as the warden. And it's also because he was so very much led by his own convictions and beliefs. And he was an anthropophysicist, very much influenced by Rudolf Steiner. And he believed explicitly, as I say in the quote here, "In our time, there is an awakening to an holistic vision of life. This involves a quickening of the spirit, a throwing wide of consciousness to encompass the eternal oneness of life, reaching beyond the restriction and limitation of sense-bound thinking." So he was described by someone who knew him very well and was very fond of him as having a manic, preacherly light in his eyes, compelling and magnetic, but clearly a deep love of literature, art, music, poetry, architecture, and a strong ability, particularly in his more workshop-orientated days of teaching, to convey his deep love for his subject. He was also an expert craftsman and woodworker and furniture maker. So why it matters? Why does a study of a college like this matter? Does it really matter at all, in that it's no longer there? But I was really interested increasingly in this community of like minds that met there. And I began to become increasingly concerned about whether it was genuinely democratizing, or if in fact the movement it made towards a much more elite form of education, which I'll mention shortly, turned it into something which was distinctly elitist. So the colleges were very much behind this idea of providing liberal arts-based education for people from all backgrounds in an environment, as we've seen, from traditionally associated with the landed gentry. But the college did become known for a range of courses. It was incredibly influential in relation to organic farming, ecology, environmental issues, industrial archaeology, musical analysis, creative arts, as well as atypically this new age spiritual education curriculum. It was very influential in sociology, in psychology, in child development. So it was highly influential, and this influence has continued. It was not something that just stopped at the point the college closed. So there was a whole range of influential speakers throughout the life of the college, right up to the end, and also influential students, including the classicist Mary Beard, Barrie Trinder, who's going to speak to us later. And we have a range of eminent speakers: Richard Hogarth, E.P. Thompson, Yehudi Menuhin, Pevsner, Patrick Moore, a whole range of incredible names who came to speak at the college. And this is an image that I'm rather fond of Mary Beard and Sean Griffiths, I think from around the late 60s, early 70s. So it was scorned to begin with. These notions of a college of this nature were very much scorned right from the start, in that we had, sorry, have I stopped? We had a sense at the time that we were going to be, sorry, just get myself back on track. Yeah, so we have this notion right from the start that this is something that the lower classes are going to engage in. This is from James Lees Milnes, who was very much a critic of social democratic reform and anything which to him smacked of communism. He was the secretary to the Country Houses Committee of the National Trust, and he believed very much in preserving and conserving this rightful order for English country houses. He talks about the idea of a little folk dancing, some social economy and Fabianism for the wives and the miners and the wives. We felt sick from the nonsense of it all. So you can see this already right from the start was kind of a focus, a form of tension around what we mean by democratizing education and how it was viewed by different parts of the establishment in particular. Trevelyan himself was very interested in this idea of living ideas, living things, the idea of this group coming together to respond to the current concerns of society and the individual. And he was increasingly concerned, particularly in the middle years of the college, that it was a point at which people come together in some sense, a kind of, he viewed it as a special and in some sense an almost priestly task. But there was an increasing focus on adult education, tutors and area organisers who took the role of moving the philosophy and ideas and promoting the college to the wider community. So I'm not going to say too much about anthropophagy because I'm aware of my time limits, but he was very much concerned that we were at the time in the depths of a materialistic age. And he was also very much aware that we are part of a living organism. This is his important influence, I think, in climate change and ecology. He was very concerned that we should try to have as a central tenet of the programme the untapped potential and creativity in the individual. However, this involved increasingly a tension between those trying to pursue a democratic line of education within the college and some of George's esoteric followers. This came to a head in one particular course, the education of specially gifted children, who were referred to as children of gold in the course, and Barrie may say a bit more about this later. So I'll talk more about how these tensions started to play out. By the time we get into the 60s, we start to see much more of a spiritual network developing of around 2,000 people who were becoming part of a known network of those interested and engaged in esoteric study. And increasingly, the courses that started to dominate in the college into the 60s and early 70s were invitation only. And it was very much the idea of sending out promotional material to a very specific group of people And very much they did not mix with the normal run-of-the-mill people who came along to the college. And what we see is this growing tension. And also we recognize that the minute the program came out, it was filled with people who were engaged in esoteric study, very often wealthy. So we see increasingly that George starts to turn towards the esoteric. We have some important courses, including The Doors of Perception after Aldous Huxley in 1961, the Death and Becoming course, which really looked at the issue of death as a release onto a higher plane of consciousness and the evolution of perceptions of death. And by the late 60s, there were at least 3 esoteric courses per term. And the house was increasingly given over to the esoteric courses for specific periods of time. We also have this growing sense of a focus on reincarnation and New Age beliefs. And this is something from Death and Becoming, an important quote from Sian Griffiths, who was one of my key interviewees, who was part of this course and attended. And as she said, a lot of people on the courses, either their animals had died recently or a member of their family, and they were grieving, and they found some comfort, not necessarily from the lectures, but of course there was, perhaps so-and-so hasn't died. Perhaps the soul is somewhere. It's powerful stuff. And what's wrong with that? And on some levels, we have this sense of a rapt audience and of Lady Sandys and Rosamond Lehman speaking on the subject of letters they had received telepathically from their dead daughters. So, you know, we're seeing this kind of tension as things become perhaps more and more unusual, but at the same time, this sense of a wonderful experience for many people who attended. This notion of stimulation, not long enough to engender loneliness, all the ongoing tensions that occur in some of the long-term colleges. This sense of fun and joy for young people. Jancis Manda was 16 when she had first attended in 1948. The brilliant lecturers, and also that important sense, as John Hassel said, that you were an important part and that you were of this network of people, you rubbing up against people from all kinds of different backgrounds, and the stimulus that created. So a huge range and diversity of courses. 40,000 students over the course of Trevelyan's 24 years. Incredibly impressive. This notion of the living word, this sense of stimulus. The sense, however, that the original purpose of the colleges were intended to cater for local and regional people. And we increasingly see from the 60s onwards, these numbers of people from London and from overseas, Jaguars and Rolls Royces parked in the drive, and the sense of people being rich hippies. We also see this shift, which I definitely discovered in my deeper analysis of some of Sir George Trevelyan's contacts and connections with members of the far right. The Soil Association was heavily associated and was very much supported by Trevelyan in its early days, and particularly via Rolf Gardner, was a close friend of his, and they were strongly involved with the British Union of Fascists. So we have these far-right tendencies which are there, not suggesting that Trevelyan himself necessarily assigned to those kind of belief systems, but we see these potential right-wing associations coming through the line of the esoteric. So, and we also see increasing staff divisions, the us and them that I referred to earlier, people finding it increasingly lonely and isolated in this beautiful remote space, and some of the tensions between the original courses, the more democratic and orientated courses, and this sense that the esoteric starts to take over. So just to come towards my conclusion. So I've continued really to explore the testimony and I've continued to interview right into 2023. And I have seen increasingly that Trevelyan's acknowledged as the godfather of the New Age, particularly in the UK. And he's credited with a huge range of developments around eclectic and esoteric learning, particularly in the arts, traditional crafts, culture and ecology, as I've mentioned already. He was in fact awarded the Right Livelihood Award in 1982 for his work on spiritual and ecological education. And I was very struck by something Lindon West said, and Lyndon's going to speak later, about the college itself in some ways and Trevelyan's influence, offering a powerful resource, this notion of the perpetual struggle of memory against power and forgetting. And I feel that this is really important about the book in particular, that as I was writing it, I was struck by this incredible buzz, this excitement, this innovation that came from these important spaces of connection between people. And I'll just go on to my final slide. So we're really starting to think about legacy and impact. So Trevelyan's had a particular influence around positive psychology, about nutrition and the body. He was a great proponent of the Alexander technique, an early exponent of veganism. He managed his own rheumatoid arthritis, which he developed in his early 60s. And he was very deeply involved in the plight of the planet, ecology, and education work, and also this growing area around mindfulness, meditation, character, and citizenship education. So I think, my last slide, hang on a sec. Yeah, I think that's it. Final slide. Findings in the future. Very quick. Oral history tour of the house was something that came from my own research, and I'm not sure if it's now occurring at Attingham, but information boards and images are certainly there throughout the house. We also have events such as Women in Attingham, at which I spoke about the research in the college. I've done my own further research on the wider adult residential colleges field in 2017 and 2018. We're working hard, as you know, through the research circle to look particularly at radical and emancipatory strands of adult education. And this year, we're focusing throughout this year on backwards travellers, looking forwards, workers' education, the miners' strike community and education. Clearly, my book's come out, and that's what the purpose of this is. Myself and Cilla Ross are going to be working on a book together, which is a much more personal project. And I think just my very final point, that this is really suggested to me the really critical importance of the residential. Do we still need it? Do we still want it? What about the importance of a space where people come together, and how increasingly these spaces like Colleague, like other examples of the colleges, are now effectively abandoned spaces. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much indeed, Sharon. That was absolutely brilliant. I've done a little emoji and a clap. Thank you so much for taking us through that incredible story, your findings, the richness of all that, are really brilliant. And I'm just so glad you've written it. So
thank you very much.
Brilliant contribution to adult education. So thank you very much indeed. I'm going to hand over to you, Ian, because I know there's already a question in the chat. So over to you, Q&A session for you and Sharon, and then we'll be taking a short break.
Thanks, Cilla. Well, just to first of all echo your comment, that was great. Some of that was familiar from chatting with Sharon before, but lots of it wasn't. So, and that's what any talk should do. So it really kind of thought-provoking. Earlier on, I'd asked John to put in the original research questions. And I picked out, listening to Sharon, the first of those. And it's about the links between Attingham and its local and regional communities. And I was just kind of thinking, right, well, and this was, I mean, to check my own geography, where it is in relation to sort of neighbouring towns and so on. So this is, on one level, it's a very sort of basic issue about location, that it's near to Shrewsbury, but also to Telford as a new town. And I wondered what whether this came up, Sharon, in any way, that you, in your talk, were talking about the shift and change in provision, but Telford as a new town in the early 60s was beginning to grow, was there any way in which there were any connections between what was happening in Telford and Attingham as a place where people could go meet and, well, do anything in terms of developing what was happening in Telford, if that makes sense?
It does make sense, Ian. Yeah, and I think it would be fair to say that the college definitely drew from the Telford area increasingly. So you see a strong connection with neighbouring towns, and increasingly as Telford evolved and developed, you start to see more and more people coming from the Telford area. I did do in the book a geographical analysis. So we do see strong local connections with the University of Birmingham, for example, with Telford College, with some of the other college, some of the college I mentioned earlier in Wellington, etc. So we have, it was a really important kind of focus in terms of trying to draw local people into the college. A lot of outreach work too. And we are starting to see more and more of that, you know, as the college develops. However, by the time you get into the 60s, as I think I really emphasised, the audience shifts dramatically towards the international and people from particularly London, as we see this shift towards the esoteric. So one of the key issues that the Board of Governors had with the college increasingly was that it could no longer sort of seek to obscure the fact that it was no longer attracting the people it was supposed to be attracting from the local and the regional areas.
Sure, yeah, and that links to that, our sort of short discussion on that links to, there's a question in the chat from William Stevenson. How much contact did Trevelyan have with US counterculture and related movements in Europe?
I think he was very influenced by the work of Timothy Leary, certainly, and I know less about Millbrook and the European Commune movement, I must confess, but he was certainly involved with leading thinkers such as Huxley, Timothy Leary, and others, some of whom did attend the college and speak at different points. So this was a growth area, as we saw towards the end. It was a fantastic experience, I think, for people actually getting access to some of these key speakers and movers. So he was critically influenced by Huxley, hence the name Doors of Perception, for example, of one of the courses. Yeah,
great. I mean, I wonder whether at this stage, I don't know what you think, Cilla, to move to what we'd thought in terms of the next phase, and then if, I'm sure through listening to others, that will then link us to other questions in the Q&A. Does that sound a good way to go? Sharon, would you be happy with that? Does that? Yeah. Okay. So, Cilla, you're on mute.
Sorry, carry on. So there's some more questions in chat, that's all, Ian.
Oh yeah, beg your pardon, I can see them coming in now. Yeah.
I know Sarah's mentioned some. Sarah Kay, who was my key contact at the National Trust curator at the time, and whether or not she could say something about Attingham's current audiences and audience aims. We'll see if we get some time at the very end, if that's all right, Sarah, if that's okay, because we're so yeah, I'm very keen and committed, by the way, also just to respond to Bernd's comment in the chat, who we've had a little bit of a dialogue via email about the importance of the future or non-future of such places, and the ways we might act collectively in order that they don't entirely disappear, or that we at least flag up their significance and importance. So that's crucially what I'm trying to do. And hopefully not single-handedly. I'm really delighted to hear about Bernd's work in Germany, for example.
Thanks very much indeed, Sharon. So are you suggesting then, Ian and Sharon, that we take our short break now?
Yeah, and then come back to yours, if that's all.
Absolutely.
Sounds a good idea.
I think that's a great idea. Thank you. So it's 55 now. If we come back at 11 on the dot, I'm going to propose that we have about 30 seconds to come back. It's always very useful if people can give us a little thumbs up on the reactions to say you're back, because I'm very mindful of time. So I do want to make sure we keep it. Thank you very much indeed. And I was so sorry to hear that a number of people, thanks Mark, thanks Ian. Yes, it's good to see those thumbs. And Owen, hello Owen. Unfortunately, I think a couple of people have had problems with the technology. So we're very, very sorry about that. And it's a great shame. But hope, you know, we will have the recording and we will have the slides that will be sent out. So thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to just spend sort of roughly 10 minutes now, and I will keep myself to time. I've got my own bit of paper. And I really just want to make a response. I was very privileged to be asked by Sharon to review the book. And I consider Sharon to be a close friend, comrade, an educational activist who I've got immense respect for. And, you know, one of the reasons I wanted to do this review was because of Sharon's own positionality. And those of you who know her know what a fantastic person she is. We know that although she's scholarly, she also wanted to make sure that this was a call to action to sort of address some of the questions that people have started to put in the chat. And of course, you know, many of her views intersect with my own, but one of the things I know animates us both is the work of people like, you know, Jonathan Rose and Sharon's view on, you know, the absolute commitment of not deifying or despising working people. And Sharon draws beautifully on Bourdieu in his conversation with Terry Eagleton. And we both share that view about class and where working class people sit in the adult education world. And like me, she doesn't see adult ed about remedying deficit, but much more about supporting people and seeing what they already bring to the table. Also, I love the fact that Sharon was actually looking at residential adult education. I was immensely interested in the fact that that question came out, that Sharon raises herself, of course, in the presentation. As someone who attended Coleg Harlech, who subsequently worked at Northern College and Ruskin, the jury's out for me on residential adult education, I have to confess. I know these days we would support, you know, that immersive experience, and there's so many great things about it. And clearly, you know, at Attingham, it was an extraordinary experience, shorter term, three days sort of courses, but immensely powerful. At the moment, you know, I'm not sure where I sit on that, because I think very much about how we intersect with our communities, and that obviously, you know, going outside of that can be challenging, and I think became problematic even in the shorter term, shorter courses that were held at Attingham. It became quite removed in some ways from its own constituencies. And I think it's important to say as well, though, that sort of autodidactic tradition that both Sharon and I and many people on this call, I'm sure, are familiar with, and it was certainly what characterized my own parents, meant, of course, that the rich liberal adult education traditions that were were personified in Attingham, certainly in its earlier phases and middle phase, and it was lovely, Sharon, thank you for identifying those three phases, was so emancipatory, because, as we all know, for many, many working class people, you know, to have an opportunity to do arts, to do humanities, to spend time together, to be away from work, was absolutely brilliant. So, you know, that was a fantastic, those were the sort of themes that I knew I was going to get from reading Sharon's book. I loved the way she brought out that notion of the post-war sense making. You know, I love Labour's 1945 manifesto, Let's Face the Future, because in that, you know, what it does is it calls on an informed democracy, an informed citizenship. And of course, as Sharon very, you know, powerfully described, that was one of the fundamental asks of both the 1919 Ministry of Reconstruction report and indeed the 1944 Act, and was a premise for many of those sort of founders of Attingham and similar similar colleges. You know, I think another brilliant theme that Sharon brings out is that tension, that deference. And when you read her book, the sort of tiptoeing on eggshells around the fact that this wasn't going to continue to be, you know, the stately home of a privileged family, but was going to have more of a greater social purpose. I felt that was handled very well. And, you know, I'm a bit, I'm ambivalent really about the National Trust, if I'm frank. I hope there's no National Trust people on this call. But, you know, the idea of keeping the aristocrats in those privileged houses while the taxpayer and the voluntary sector manages the rest. But that notion of democratizing education in the face of that privilege is so brilliantly drawn out in Sharon's book. And also, and Tom will be talking about this later, the early period where the pedagogy was so interesting. You know, I mean, we see how Trevelyan, of course, was so much informed and influenced by the folk high schools, that notion of enlivenment, that idea, which, you know, is relatively new to me, but, you know, the idea, as Sharon describes it, teachers speaking directly from the heart on subjects that they found inspiring. To do that in, you know, sort of almost co-produced spaces where, you know, people can sort of work together towards a learning and a really rich learning in a short period of time. And of course, having that type of content at a time of, you know, quite utilitarian education and training was really, really important. So Sharon does a fantastic job bringing those themes out. They're the things that grab me. So what did I, you know, the couple of minutes I've got left, what did I make of that experiment and what conclusions did I draw from adult education? And all I can do here is bring out a few pointers, because what Sharon clearly does, and she just does this so well in her writing, you know, she's upfront and honest about what the great strengths were of that whole educational experiment, but she's not slow in also highlighting where some of the tensions, the ambiguities, and frankly, you know, some of the sort of unpleasant sides of it for me, from where I'm sitting politically, certainly the sort of flirtation in some, you know, the far right that she draws out so well. So that it's an uneasy book, but it's a wonderful book. But I was particularly interested in, you know, how sadly in some ways, I think a lot of that social purpose disappeared as we moved towards that third phase. I think that the concerns for me about, you know, the residential piece is, you know, as we've said, it creates great critical spaces. And Sharon in particular draws on Livingston in 1941, you know, how state funding can create those spaces which, you know, give it a potential of a great emancipation. But other than the earlier period when there was that close association with local communities, as Sharon describes, what we increasingly saw was some distancing from that, and perhaps the constituency that Attingham drew upon became narrower as time went on. And I think that sort of the idea of how, you know, it started off as something for what was deemed to be lower class people, and, you know, that sort of mutual relationship that E.P. Thompson talks about, that adult education should be. You know, I think Sharon is very clear in posing whether, you know, how much that was the case in the later period as the content, although the non-esoteric courses continued to be taught, then of course there was less and less emphasis on them. And of course we mustn't remove the context. What was happening was the drying up of funding for the short course programs. But Sharon does pose the question, you know, was this part, you know, she drawing on Raymond Williams in particular, of course, you know, the deepest impulse of the sort of to make learning part of the process of social change itself. And my view about this, when I got to the end of Attingham, reading about it, thinking about it, reading Sharon's brilliant analysis, was that I don't think it got there with that. It was actually a very short experiment, you know, only 30 years. Who knows what would have gone on to have happened. And I just want to, if I may, just share one slide in conclusion, and I hope you can see this. I wanted to use this slide because I went to an absolutely brilliant short film. I hope you can see that slide. Short film the other night. A brilliant photographer called Tish Murphy, who took photographs. She's a working class woman, massively came from a deeply impoverished background. But what she did at the same time as Attingham, you know, there's some sort of those esoteric courses were taking place, was taking photographs in the Northeast, which, you know, were actually acts of solidarity. And what I think the Tishes of this world did was thinking about adult education, was to actually bring out the tenderness, the humor, the reality, the potential, the possibility of working class people. And I think, you know, what happens in some of the, perhaps in some of our the more formal types of adult education, as we saw at Attingham and many other places, perhaps didn't reach out to the sort of communities they could have reached out to. So when I, in conclusion, think about, you know, Sharon's title, looking backwards to forge the future, my big ask would have been, let's look around at what we have. Let's look around at the people we have in our communities that frankly were being shafted through industrialization. And Sharon asks a really important question in her beautiful book, which is, you know, would this content have been right for what was going on in the world around it, where it was being delivered in this stately home? Of course it's relevant. Of course it would have been absolutely important and critical. But at the same time, as that social purpose was lost or displaced as time went on, as the spiritual positioning became clearer and clearer, it was brilliant to look at new worlds, brilliant looking at new utopias, new ways of running the world. As a cooperator, I will always look to the cooperative commonwealth, but actually, what was it actually doing in terms of the type of adult education for social purpose and as a public good? So that's just my very quick, rather scattergun response to the brilliant book. And all I will say is that if you disagree with some of the things I've said, and of course you probably may well do, it just shows how much it prompted. You know, it really prompted me to think what was going on in the world when this experiment was also going on. And I think looking at that wider context, which I know is one that Sharon is intimately interested and concerned with as well, it was useful to just bring Tish's pictures in to remind me as well as to share them with you. So thank you very much indeed. And I have great pleasure to immediately hand over to Lindon. I'm sorry, Lindon, I've gone 2 minutes over, but hopefully we can catch that back. So thank you.
Thank you, Cilla. I'd love to have a discussion with you about some of the points, but I have a particular brief and my time is also short. I think I want to say right from the outset, I found this a generous book. It's a kind of generous dialogue, as I see it, with history, with George Trevelyan, and with different movements, I think, that have shaped and formed adult education. It's a generous dialogue with Trevelyan, despite, I think, as Cilla alluded to and others, darker, troubling shades surrounding Trevelyan's ideas on the superiority of Aryan peoples, for instance, or inherited nobility. But Sharon, in her generosity, continues to kind of dialogue with someone we might easily and too easily dismiss as a crank and maybe a top. Dialogue as well is an easy word to use, but difficult to achieve. My wife tells me sometimes the view of dialogue I hear is listen very carefully, take time, but they'll eventually end up thinking exactly like me. I think dialogue, I don't see it in those terms. And the dialogue in the book, as I see it, is about openness to and learning from the other, however hard it is. Sharon, as a number of people have alluded to, the academic and working class woman from a mining community, learning from a very different other. That is the spirit of the very best of adult education. Learning about the place of the spiritual, the interior world, our emotions, nature, and mysticism in part reaching back, I think, to Romanticism, as well as the beauty and truth of art and music, and perhaps, and this might be contentious, the importance of the divine and sacred in human life. You don't have to agree with everything, but learning like this needs a generous spirit, and I think Sharon embodies that in her work. This engagement with Romanticism, in effect, as well as the spiritual and religious, I think is long overdue. Despite their central place in the history of adult education, they're not always seen sympathetically by progressive scholars. Rationality is not fitted well with notions of divine or God in any form, while the idea of divine spirit in all things, as in animism, for instance, or of the sacred status we should afford to nature as we become more aware of its complexity, vulnerability, extraordinary beauty, and interdependence has not really been there. Technical rationality can haunt the academy, with I see it as occasional traces in the adult education literature. Technical rationality, the world is out there, objective and measurable. Spirituality, even forms of psychology, get short shrift. But there is more than one spiritual and or religious perspective. There is more than the men in black and patriarchal hierarchies, or noble elites of one kind or another leading us, the masses, towards the light. There's this powerful spirituality in sensitivity towards the planet, and a kind of animism, as I said, a sacred quality in everything that New Age sensibility and George Trevelyan pointed us towards. He, and others of course, lead us to wonder what we are doing to our planet Earth, as nature is despoiled and the rich greedily consume and retreat to their private islands. And adult education of any imaginative, inclusive, questioning and dialogical kind has become marginal. This is part of our crisis. I'd love to dialogue further with Sharon, Trevelyan too, in an imaginative sense, about notions of the spiritual. It would include imaginative reflections on the wonder of the fact that we're alive at all, and that as human beings, we're often driven to ask fundamental or ultimate questions of meaning and purpose, especially perhaps in troubled, fractious times like ours. Sharon skillfully revisits aspects of adult education history, weaving in thoughts from key inspirational figures like Richard Henry Tawney, Paulo Freire, and Raymond Williams. Tawney, a Christian ethical socialist, saw the development of the tutorial university WA tutorial class movement before and after the First World War, groups of 20 or more adults learning to dialogue, sometimes across profound political differences, as a kind of incarnation of the kingdom, a democratic community of learners, seekers after the form and meaning of the good society in a vibrant, at best, vibrant synthesis of lived experience and the world of ideas and the imagination. An embodiment, if you like, at best, of the learning, bottom-up, participative democratic community that Williams also thought essential in his long revolution. Or, in Paulo Freire's liberation theology, drawing on Jewish theologian Martin Buber, adult education is a space where an I meets a thou, not an it, and the whole becomes so much more than the sum of the parts. Sharon's whole book is much more than the sum of its parts. Sharon concludes her dialogue with Trevelyan in a generous spirit of recognition of the importance he gave to creative spaces for debate about meaning and possibilities for humanity, of his encouragement of the idea of learning from the body, learning from illness too, and its meaning across a life. There is his ecological sensibility and focused on the health of nature, of which we are a part. Trevelyan inspired the Soil Association and the idea that the poor state of the soil is one indication of a planet's distress. And his celebration of the importance of community and conviviality, as well as empathic dialogue in residential settings. Taking time out in beautiful surroundings. I've been working on the history of the Kent miners, who greatly valued the residential experience, whether at Balliol College, Rewley House, or Ruskin College in Oxford. It helped consolidate learner identities and motivations to keep on keeping on in a collective economic, social, cultural, and educational struggle. Which leads me, watching the time carefully, to a final reflection on the nature of our crises and why at core this is partly spiritual, even religious, in a way that Trevelyan and hopefully Sharon understand. Eugene McGarath's wonderful book, The Enchantments of Mammon, How Capitalism Became the Religion of Modernity, should be read alongside Sharon's. Here, the allures and illusions of capitalism seduce. Neoliberalism enchants influential economists, and the false gods of overconsumption tempt us all. This is a place of it objectification and manipulation of nature. Our planet reduced to an it, a matter of utility and consumption, and damn the consequences. A paradise lost. But we can still imagine our affairs as motivated by truer, saner, and more generous standards than productivity, technological innovation, and patterns of consumption. Paradise could still be regained, as both Sharon and Trevelyan might just agree, regained not least through the best of adult education, including beautiful moments of residential experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lindon. That was absolutely brilliant. I was just looking for your reference on the religion of modernity to put in the chat, because maybe if you find that, it'd be great. Thank you so much. That was very powerful, and well, I know Sharon will want to respond to it later, but thank you so much for that very thought-provoking There's thought-provoking comments, actually, and they do remind me of how I'm always in search of a better world. So why I'm down on potential experience, I'm not sure. But thank you so much indeed, Lindon. I have great pleasure now in passing over to Barrie Trinder. You're on now, Barrie, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome you. Thank you so much. And over to you. I know you're going to share your experiences of batting with us. Thank you very much indeed.
I would rather like to talk about the non-esoteric aspects of Attingham. I'm probably less sympathetic than Sharon is to much of what George Trevelyan did, but that doesn't subtract anything from my admiration for him as an adult educationalist. I first knew Attingham for 2 or 3 courses probably as a student. I was teaching in my first job, a big comprehensive school in West Bromwich. I was principally teaching history, but in my second year there, I had to teach an English set in the second year. And we had a new head of the English department, Anthony Adams, who spent much of his career teaching English teachers in the education department at Cambridge. And Tony Adams had taught in East Anglia with Albert Hunt, who was one of the 3 adult education tutors employed by what was then called Salop County Council. The idea behind the appointment, Martin Wilson, very great head of the Shropshire Education Department, he had hoped, as schools in Shropshire gradually were converted to comprehensives, to appoint in each of them an adult education organiser. It would have been a total of about 12, but as he admitted, sadly, it only ever got to 3. And Anthony Adams brought over several of the staff to courses at Attingham, which Albert Hunt ran on film, on literature, and one of them on television. Had the great privilege of hearing Richard Hoggart and Stuart Hall both speak on the same morning. And it was a marvellous place to be. And George, a little eccentric, but very, very welcoming. It was something, I wanted to be part of. And within a year or so, a vacancy came up. I was a very keen historian, doing a lot of research of my own, and took up the post in the spring of 1965, and apart from organising courses across the county, it was expected that I would contribute to what was happening at Attingham. Roughly speaking, running a course every term and possibly contributing to one or two others that I didn't organise, and every other year pretty well running a summer school. When I left my job in West Bromwich, I was given a book token by fellow members of staff and spent it on Edward Thompson's Making of the English Working Class. Fantastic book. And one of the great things about the new post and having the responsibility of organising courses at Attingham, I could invite people of substance to come and talk. And Edward came and spoke at the first course I ran there, and absolutely electrified the audience. It's marvellous. And for someone new to adult education, a real example of how to do things. No slides, not even extracts from sources, but just brilliant speaking. But I'd heard from Albert something of the esoteric courses that were going on, and that on the whole, throughout the period I was there, they didn't really impinge on me very much. There were meetings of tutors from local authority and Birmingham University with George and Brian Podmore, later with Geoffrey Toms, the deputy wardens. But there was no discussion of the esoteric courses at all. We were presented with a calendar. Those courses were firmly there, and no discussion about them. Some discussion about other courses. But by and large, as far as history was concerned, I was left to do what I wanted, which was very nice for someone then only in their mid-20s. It was a great opportunity. And when teaching at Attingham, it was always a great pleasure that George took on the role of welcoming people so effectively. There's no sense on any courses that I ran of any sort of high table. I always sat with students, always made sure that my guest lecturers sat with students, and George did himself. The reference to high tables in Sharon's book will take a little bit of exception to. It's really just a matter of fact. I think possibly they took place at esoteric courses, but I don't know. But I can give two examples of what I saw of esoteric course. One was a course where I'd invited my friend Brian Harrison, who completed the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, and is now Sir Brian. And it was very curious because Brian had researched the temperance movement, produced a wonderful book on the subject, and he was very interested in, I think it was Sir George's uncle, Sir Walter Trevelyan, and politely asked him about it. And it's the one occasion I've ever seen George do anything that was at all ill-mannered. He just shut up completely. He did not want to talk about it. And that weekend was the only weekend I've ever shared with an esoteric course, and that was really weird. There were a few privileged students invited to sherry in George's study before the first Friday evening lecture. They seemed very odd, very wealthy, but can't really say a lot more about it. I find it impossible to engage Bernard Nesfield Cookson in conversation on anything. The other occasion was the one Sharon referred to, the course on gifted children, which was in my second term there. I didn't organise it. I didn't really know much about it, but having recently been working in a secondary school, I was anxious to hear what went on, and there was this curious division between a lot of people who normally attended esoteric courses, who were very much taken in by the idea of children of gold moving amongst us and so on, and really hard-headed educationalists who were saying, well, yeah, there's a problem. You find a 7-year-old who's a wonderfully gifted mathematician. What do you do with him or her? Because he or she clearly needs to be learning mathematics away from the normal class context. And there are ways of solving this, but those who were from the esoteric courses, it seemed to me in the end their argument was, well, my grandson, and who has ever met a grandson who isn't brilliant, my grandson needs to go to Eton and I need some financial support for it. But I want to dwell on more positive things, really. The enormous contribution which Attingham made to the development of various aspects of social history, Roman archaeology, place name studies, and some topics which are, nothing to do with my particular interests, like botany, geology, and so on. There is a very comprehensive Shropshire flora, which was produced as a result of courses at Attingham. There are about 10 volumes of studies of Shropshire place names published at Nottingham, I think, which are directly the result of a course that was started at Attingham, a research class that ran from 1964 to 1988, when new government regulations closed it. So it did make an enormous influence. It did contribute very markedly to the development of the museum at Ironbridge. I was able to run a course on the history of the Coalbrook Vale coalfield every about this time of year annually, and that did attract considerable numbers of people from the Telford area coming in very often as day students rather than residents. And we did usually have a small exhibition in the main entrance hall at Attingham of documents, a few artifacts, and that we made a point of inviting influential people, politicians, some of the managing director of the Lilleshall Company, and so on. And I think it did have a considerable effect, particularly meeting eminent scholars from elsewhere who'd been invited to lecture. This did have an important effect and helped to establish the foundations of the Ironbridge Gorge Museum. It also, I think, enabled people from all over the country of all sorts of backgrounds to get some contact with what was happening, very exciting things by and large happening in social history at the time. And here there's a bit of a blank with George. I mean, he didn't in any way oppose what was going on, but people like Raphael Samuel had a very different concept of English history from George's, which was largely, as far as social history concerned, derived from his uncle's book of, jollities around the village green, and the squire being philanthropic to his villagers. But it was a time of great excitement, and one of the tributes to it came from Bill Mail, who was at the University of Oklahoma, but an acknowledged authority on English social history in the 19th century, but also a leading authority on adult education in the United States. And he came to one weekend and wrote me a marvelous letter afterwards saying, what a privilege it had been to speak and debate with such a variety of people in the class. That was a weekend, as I remember it, which filled the house, and so there were probably getting on for 100 people, which is rather a lot for closely argued discussion, but it was a good weekend after all. So I'm been talking really about what happened in the last of the three periods that Sharon defined, from 1965 onwards, and really on beyond George's wardenship. And one minor quibble I might have with Sharon's book is that she perhaps doesn't make enough of the change which Geoffrey Toms brought about. There were some very influential courses took place in Attingham's last years, including the one which set up the international organisation on industrial heritage. And finally, just a political matter about the end of Attingham. I don't think it was in any way brought about directly by George's esoteric courses. They were just one element which the enemies of adult education in Shropshire were able to throw against the college, and the subsequent demolition of adult education structures in the county, which came within months of the election of the Thatcher government, and the clear opposition to the whole idea that the lower orders should have some education that came from people like the then chair of the Further Education Committee. This was nothing to do with esoteric courses. It was sheer objection to the idea of adult education anyway. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Barrie. I want to get my emoji to clap, but thank you so much. I mean, wonderful that you can share that experience. You know, you've been, you can. It's so important that we understand that, and thank you for such a close reading of Sharon's book. I know how valuable that has been to her, and thank you for your last point, which of course was the closure was, as you quite rightly say, ideological. You know,
yes,
there's getting away from that, and sadly that's carried on being the case. But thank you very much for that really powerful and interesting perception and contribution. Thank you. Okay, we are now going to move to our final speaker, Tom Woodin, and that gives us a bit of time at the end, because I'm looking at Tom, Tom's looking at me, I'm going to hold my paper up to make sure that we actually do address some of the fantastic and thought-provoking questions that have popped up in the chat. And I know we're not going to be able to get to all of them, Sharon and Ian, but I know you want to have a bit of a go at addressing some of those. And then, of course, Sharon's concluding remarks. Thank you so much, everybody, so far. And now it's a pleasure to hand over to my fellow moderator, Tom. Hello, Tom.
Thank you, Cilla. I was asked to talk about. I enjoyed all those talks, by the way, and thank you, everyone, and Sharon in particular. And just mentioning Barrie's point there, really, he remembered with great affection spending some of his cash on Edward Thompson's Making English Working Class. I think probably everyone on this call and a whole swathe of our kind of society can recall when they first came across that book. I certainly can. Thank you for that. So I was asked to talk about a kind of cooperation, and I interpret this broadly in terms of organisation and organisational kind of factors involved. So thank you. And before I talk about the book, I would say I also came to, there was a conference attached to this early on in the project that I know Sharon and John organised, and there's some lovely publicity of Attingham Hall, and I thought, fantastic, I'll be staying on the estate, I'll be walking out in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, you know, maybe have a dip in the lake or river, whatever there is locally. And as it turned out, we were on the estate, but it was the industrial estate on the edge of Shrewsbury. And it was the weekend of the Brexit vote, which was absolutely fascinating, sitting, watching everyone eating their eggs and bacon in the morning, and David Cameron on the making his announcement. The conference, however, was fascinating, as was reading Sharon's book, which I thought, I'm going to raise sort of 4 or 5 points, I think in the style of Sharon's book, to kind of historical points that I found interesting from an organisational kind of point of view, and then I'd also draw out 4 or 5 points in relation to, as Sharon does, in relation to the current practice and future of adult learning. So it is a really interesting kind of bringing together of historical and contemporary trends, this book, I think. It tells us much about the way that post-war modernity is constructed on the basis of the historical resources that are very apparent in British society at the time. And so in doing so, it inevitably confuses and reconfigures ideas about the past and the present, and confuses our ideas about political kind of divisions. And that you can see very clearly, and this book is one example, but you can see very clearly how kind of modernity and tradition really buffered up against each other in the 60s and visibly kind of almost exploded in a way. I mean, we're always dealing with the past and the present, you know, continuity and change, but at certain historical moments, it becomes very intense, if you like, and I think the 60s was perhaps one of those. And then you've got Trevelyan, who's this fascinating figure, a kind of charismatic, driven individual who is who at one level is working to maintain, as he sees it, his rightful kind of inheritance. You know, he's been de-inherited by his father, the Charles Trevelyan, the kind of Labour education minister, who kept, as Sharon points out, kept his house and then obviously didn't leave it to his children. You know, nowadays we have the ski, it's a ski generation, it's called, you know, spend your kids' inheritance as quickly as possible. But he's kind of almost like he sees himself as a knightly figure, which is fascinating, you know, and he uses the building to great effect. You know, these buildings have incredible power and resonance and kudos that I know. I've just been working on the history of the Co-op College that bought a big stately home near Loughborough, and they carry incredible resonance at this time, and very kind of metaphorically in terms of kind of building a new Jerusalem, if you like. And then from that, he also, you know, as this figure, he then builds on popular cultural and educational kind of initiatives of the Second World War, perhaps, you know, famously the Committee for Encouragement of Music and the Arts, and also ABCA, the Army Bureau of Current Affairs, which both brought drama, music, art, and discussion to kind of, you know, ordinary people, as it were. Again, there's a kind of romance about that, but he had a sense that this tradition needed to be continued, and it's fascinating seeing him go out to villages and towns to drum up support. You know, I think he knew that he had to earn his keep, as it were, and he had to get some, you know, people onto his courses, and so that's a fascinating kind of dialogue that's going on there, I think. And then from that, there's a whole range that Barrie was alluding to, and others. The diversity and richness of the curriculum is always fascinating, I think, for, you know, in adult education. To list them, you know, the archaeology, history, the current affairs, the music, the ecology, the kind of children and home courses for women, the arts and craft, the architecture and art, all in at one hand very separate, but on the other hand quite making quite a powerful statement when you put them together. Clearly they're attracting different groups of people to some extent, but there perhaps are also crossovers. They also lead to new forms of experimentation among tutors, among people who come and perhaps suggest new courses. And so you get glimpses of this kind of creativity. You know, I think we all have this kind of, there's that famous quote from Marx, isn't there, that, you know, in the morning, I can't remember it, but in the morning I'll be an architect, and in the afternoon a builder and an academic. And yeah, well, we all have that lovely utopian vision, perhaps, that we can all do everything. But it is worth keeping alive some of that, and you certainly get a sense of that there's an attempt at this kind of holistic educational vision from Attingham. And then the fifth point, I guess, not that I'm necessarily counting them all, but I've written them down here in numbers. Then a set of more opaque relationships that Sharon usefully examines, leading to these kind of new age esoteric courses. Some of them, there's a kind of behind the scenes working, Trevelyan being able to work various committees, working the lady Berwick, was it, who lived there, working the National Trust, but also then linking to wider communities beyond the geographical ones of Shropshire to attract the kind of new age group, which has clearly had some political ambiguities, but at the same time, you know, engaging with those ideas led to some quite creative outputs, and perhaps is a thought for us today about engaging with and understanding things like Brexit and other movements that not everyone is entirely enthusiastic about. And then so from there to think about, I've got 4 points just to think about the adult education and the future to some extent. Certainly, I've mentioned cooperation a few times, adult education, collaboration, all these ideas leading on from the last point do tend to help us think across and beyond certain political divisions and constituencies. Even though we may have certain commitments, there's a need to engage, if you like, with wider and diverse audiences and constituencies, which is perhaps what was being alluded to earlier in terms of the need for dialogue and mutual understanding that involves change on both sides. Trevelyan's notion of leadership is very interesting, and I think if you unpacked it, you would find different ideas about leadership, which necessarily involve notions of followership. You know, what is the relationships going on there? How are things being done? Is leadership for? Are things being done? When things are being done for people, they often benefit the giver more than the recipient. I think often, you know, whereas when you're working with people, it's perhaps a different set of processes that is much more mutual and reciprocal. Thirdly, institutions are in some ways very problematic, hard to keep up, hard to finance, hard to organize, but they do have a longevity, and they do have the capacity to attract kind of multiple informal kind of networks who can draw on common resources, and I guess we need to rethink that, because certainly adult education has lost virtually all of its resources that it had, you know, rethinking how we might regain, obviously rethinking how we can organize informally without the need for a lot of resources is very productive, but at the same time, at some point, as you know, being able to create a movement that could sustain itself over a period of time through difficult times as well as easy ones is something to think about. And this relates to, of course, tensions in the state to some extent. And Sharon's book brings this out quite nicely, I think. Many different resources, agencies, levels of the state, so are sometimes in conflict, but sometimes they're not. You know, so you've got local government, you've got national trust, if I can call that as a sort of informal arm's length type body related to the state, that certainly developed a certain version of common resources for the nation, but at times in the late 19th century that challenged existing forms of common ownership, because, if you like, people couldn't be trusted to sustain them. And you do find that tension in the late 19th century that I think Sharon talks about in the book a bit. And it's often been said, you know, the stately home has had more comebacks than Audrey Hepburn, but the stately home never really went away. I mean, and whether and so if I can just finish by returning perhaps to John's cup of tea, you know, and maybe we need more cups of tea like that, where you turn up and start to question the institution and say, well, you know, why is it being organized like this and not in another way? And these are common resources for the nation, you know, are there other creative ways that adult education could, you know, appropriately be part of, you know, so to underplay, so just to perhaps re-establish adult education as a legitimate tradition of the 19th, 20th century, you know, rather than just always seeing the stately home as something that we need to maintain in its original aspect, if you like. I'll stop there, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Really interesting, thought-provoking, some great provocative questions that you ended up on there in terms of adult education. So thank you very, very much indeed. Again, I know I'm speaking on behalf of everyone. Thank you to all the speakers for such careful readings. of Sharon's book. I think Sharon will be really chuffed, I will be, because we've all done what we wanted to do rather than what we were told to do, and really enjoyed it. So thank you very much indeed. We finished brilliantly on time, so thank you very much for the respect speakers that you've shown in managing to do that. I'm now going to hand over to Ian and Sharon, who are going to address some of the questions in chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cilla. I mean, to echo again what you've just said, I think that each of these different strands and each of the different elements of Sharon's book have been highlighted in the contributions in a range of different ways. I just sent Sharon a message a few minutes ago about whether there were particular comments that she wants to highlight in terms of the concluding comments. And when I looked at them earlier, the comments from both Olwyn and Claire struck me as being really interesting. Big questions, but ones that were also kind of pretty fundamental, which is perhaps how and where we situate the particular example of Attingham in that wider immediate post-war scope. And I guess that linked back to that question I was interested in about somewhere like Telford, and this is just like one example. And I know it also, in parallel ways, Lindon made reference to in other parts of the country, like in Kent, access to places like Ruskin. And I remember myself working in Northampton and opportunities to go to places like Nuston Hall with colleagues and with students. So Sharon, I didn't know whether you'd got any thoughts yourself as part perhaps of those concluding comments, whether you wanted to pick up on any of those points or whether you wanted to make some wider responses.
Yeah. I was very struck by Owen's comment about something of the failure of the Labour government's really quite energetic and powerful manifesto rhetoric, which perhaps didn't translate into reality. And I think that point's really well made. And I just referring to Owen's comments about, you know, the Labour politicians perhaps looking favourably on the idea of this as a kind of alternative or creative add-on, but this kind of this tension with kind of state provision. And this is something that Bernd Keplinger, who's on the call, and I were sort of talking about a little bit via email last night, in the sense that there was only paid leave. I think the first paid leave was 1938, so this was pretty late on. People frequently struggled to have time out to take on educational leave. This was quite distinct from, as I understand it, from some of the Scandinavian countries, Denmark in particular, where there is paid educational leave, and that continues to the day. This makes a massive difference in terms of A, how people perceive education of this type, and B, their ability to access it. And now we see increasingly, of course, that when people do go on courses, so often they're very expensive. They're outside the pocket of most working people. And even at the time when Attingham was running, we were talking £2 to £4 for a weekend. This was quite a considerable sum, as I'm not sure if people are aware just how much that might represent in real terms in contemporary money. You know, we are talking sort of £100, £200 in some instances, and this is money that people could often ill afford. So there was always this tension with these kinds of bodies and institutions. They always ended up being the purview of the middle class, to be absolutely frank about it. And I think this is something that needs to be acknowledged, but I think that's probably in spite of the efforts of people like the leaders of the colleges, because we have this issue around state support or lack thereof, which has been an ongoing issue, not just the destruction of the adult education community and its spaces, as we've seen increasingly over the last 10, 15, 20 years, and the clear and ideological assault on adult education. But we are seeing also that we do not have a policy script that even recognises this kind of broad-based education anymore. We're entirely focused on education for young people, which is focused on their work and their ability to be hard-working economic units. This is a total destruction of a kind of world that we might see still hanging on in some of the Scandinavian countries, where there is more state support in terms of funding for this kind of access to education, and also they are given paid educational leave. That's a luxury we've never had. So I just wanted to comment on that in response to Owen's point, and also Claire's very important point about the fact that a lot of socialist leaders seem to have lost the sense of the importance of these kinds of college spaces, and this increase in tension that such colleges weren't for working class communities ultimately, and that they have not really fought to maintain and retain those kinds of spaces as perhaps we would strongly argue that they should have done. So it's become, they've just been kind of lost, they're becoming increasingly lost to history, lost spaces, which is why my book was, why I'm so passionate about the fact that we can't just allow this to be something of a memory, and indeed the memory is flawed itself. So this is why such an analysis seemed to me to be really important. I was just seeing if there are any more questions from the chat that I would be able to pick up on. Several people made points about the importance of young people's access to such spaces. It would be fair to say that the demographics at Attingham were largely middle-aged. I think that would be the truthful statement. Barrie might know differently, but from my analysis of all the visitors' handbooks, the visitors' books, and student records that I could find, and they were fairly sketchy, it was largely middle-aged and older people. Though I also mentioned, I think, that people like Jancis Mander were there at 16, that there was strong connection with local schools. And so there was an attempt certainly to kind of build that relationship with younger people. Several people have mentioned the importance of such spaces for young people, but the problem is that such spaces no longer exist. So what can we do? Those spaces just aren't there. We've seen a comprehensive closure of these adult education colleges escalating over the last 10 or 15 years. They're virtually gone. There are a couple of longer term residential spaces who also do short term residential courses, importantly, Fircroft and Northern College, but many of the spaces that have been alluded to, Muston Hall and Burleston, or the important spaces that I think of, Memorial College, etc., have gone and have been closed up by the authorities, and some have just been left to languish as buildings completely closed, locked up, and left to crumble, like Coleg Harlech and other spaces. So, we have this issue of, it would be wonderful to engage more with younger people in such spaces, but we don't have them anymore. That's the truth of the matter. That doesn't mean to say, as several people have said, that we give up some kind of fight for this sort of space of dialogue and debate. And that's the point that I think has been most importantly made throughout everybody's comments, contributions, and presentations. These skills, this emphasis on skills policies, I increasingly feel, though, John Hoft and I have been actively involved with something called the Centenary Commission on Adult Education, where we've really tried to influence policymakers. We've really tried to get them to think beyond this very narrow skills-based policy framework. And we have come up against repeatedly a kind of narrow neoliberal definition of education every single time. So I think we really do need to think much more actively about how we can create alternative spaces. It's something we've tried to do through the research circles, which meet, and we've been meeting since about 2020 now, which is an online space whereby people who come together from all kinds of backgrounds, practitioners, academics, people interested in education more generally to talk about and debate key issues in adult education. It isn't a physical space, but it has been a really important theoretical and philosophical space for debating these points and issues, and for hoping to try and press for urgent change before adult education spaces are completely lost. Yeah, it was, as I said in my book right at the start, my book was a call to arms, and that's exactly what I want it to be. So, you know, I want people, and I'm hoping that people, even on the call today, are interested enough perhaps to attend the research circles, which were outlined in the Eventbrite link, and the dates, and focus for those, but also to get involved with us more intensively. Perhaps maybe we need a group to talk about some of the key points from the book, and to take some of them forward if people are interested. So I don't know what else is left for me to say on that point. Has anyone got any more questions? I've just seen a couple of points from Claire, you know, about the importance of creating a network which can perhaps actively fight for the remaining residential colleges, and the need for such spaces. And a salvo, I think, to us all. One of the things that I learned through COVID, not always in a pleasant or enjoyable manner either, was how vital online spaces have become and how important they can be as a point of connection between people, how much people learn now online, which is, and I don't detract from that in any way, I do it myself all the time. However, do we still need important places to meet? Do we still need these spaces where we can get together? And I think in the post-Brexit days, the days where we're facing the ideological and political fallout in the UK at the moment of 15 years of decline and betrayal, perhaps we really do need to think more about how we can actively work together to counter some of this through bringing people together to talk about difficult points, difficult subjects. Sarah and John have mentioned a couple of times about National Trust-based stately homes, and my knowledge of other colleges that were based in stately homes. To be honest, I'd probably struggle to come up with them at the top of my head right now, but I'm very happy to try and put something together. I am aware that quite a few of the residential colleges were also based in National Trust properties, but I'd need to do a little bit more digging into my own back research to put that together. And I am aware from Sarah's work at Attingham, Sarah Kay's work at Attingham, and others, that there's a definite effort to try to encompass the whole range of experiences that the National Trust, certainly at Attingham, of the different periods of Attingham's life, much more comprehensively than perhaps has been done in the past. So any other points from anyone from our panel? That would be really helpful.
No, I would just reinforce the point, if I may, about, I mean, I totally and utterly value having those spaces where people collectively can come together, that you can't beat it. But I also think, and it sometimes takes an imagination that when you get to my sort of age, you know, you have to work upon. There are other learning spaces. There are lots of young people working in different learning spaces. And I thought it was quite illuminating that sometimes how we used to do learning is lost in folk memory of younger people. So, for example, and I draw a parallel with a conversation that was on the radio yesterday with the new, and then hopefully incoming Labour government's commitment to renationalising the railways. And of course, quite a lot of young people haven't really got a clue what nationalisation is. They're not against it, but it's just outside of frame of reference, folk memory, and all the rest of it. And I just think we need to, but that doesn't mean they're not for it, and it doesn't mean they're not doing it. And I just think we need to be mindful of that. Learning happens, as we know, in many, many different ways and in many different spaces. So I just always check myself in a reflective way when I need to consider the role of the residential. But as someone who had it for 2 years, I I would never swap that for anything, you know, but I'm just saying there's lots of rich stuff going on at the same time.
Sharon, could I just say one thing which points us forward to the third of our virtual seminars on the miners? And it's particularly appropriate, of course, with the anniversary of the 84.5 strike. But it's in the context of paid educational leave. It's in the context of our searching for infrastructures that can provide substantial experiences for people. I think if looking back in history, as it were, trying to think forward as well, it's extraordinarily important, I think, and it's something I've learned so much in looking at the Kent miners, how important the trade union, latterly the NUM, the Kent miners before that, was in creating, as it were, the financial resources but for people to participate in adult education locally, nationally in places like Ruskin and Rewley House and Balliol, and internationally. It was all a kind of seamless web that enabled people to move from the international, we might say the global, right back to the very local. So I think, as I see it, part of our revisiting the history, and I take Cilla's point, I think these things are quickly forgotten.
Absolutely.
And the history of adult education is something that's dangerously easily forgotten. I think we can enter the spirit again of some of these movements and maybe recharge our own batteries. And it encourages our imagination to think, well, maybe there's something that can be done in this small way, but small things can lead to much bigger things.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah, and I don't know if Tom or Ian or Barry wanted to say anything at all just to finish, but I just wanted to say that for me, I think the point of conversation about these issues so that we remember them, and not just remember them, but we allow them to influence how we might think differently in the future. So we learn from history, but very much to inform the future is the whole point and focus of the 3 events this year of the research circles. And I think writing the book for me and undertaking the research has really it's really kind of emphasized for me this vital space for difficult conversations sometimes too. It's what we've ceased to do in many ways, and which is so vitally important when we're in such kind of ideological tension at the moment as a country. And I think this is such an important point. So just a quick plea from me, if anyone is interested, we're going to send notes out from today's event as well as the recording. I'm going to try and identify and respond to some of the key themes that have come out, as I've already said, I think. And it would be wonderful if people want to start to take part or engage with the research circle if you haven't previously. And if also if you want to enter some dialogue with me, I'd really welcome it. There's only so much you can say about a book in half an hour or even 2 hours with all the excellent contributions, but I think this dialogue needs to be ongoing. So I'd be very grateful if people express their interest at the end of this. Any last words from anyone?
Sharon, could I just say one thing? John here. In the chat, I just got this idea of doing some kind of quick job on the loss of adult education spaces with pictures of the adult education spaces that have gone and that kind of thing. I don't know whether there's anything in that, whether it would be possible to use this kind of network to put together some illustrations and so on and so forth to prod the minds and memories and creative futures of politicians. I may be just being over optimistic. But if anybody is interested in that, maybe they could get in touch with us. And it's not only whether they could be interested, whether they could contribute anything by way of pictures and images of places, either in their past states or in their future or in their current states.
Yeah.
I put into the chat a picture I took of Kingsgate College in Broadstairs a couple of years ago, which has now been redeveloped as, you know, attractive flats. But it was a adult residential college run by, I think, the YMCA, and was a big force in adult education locally. Now gone, and I'm sure there are dozens and dozens and dozens of these, and it's just to give illustrations of the of what is lost, really, that would be useful.
I think it's a really good idea, John, because I think that sort of physical memory jog. I know that Derek and Erica are here. I'm very grateful to them being here. But Derek Tatton was the warden of Wedgwood Memorial College in Barlaston. And I am aware that that site has been basically mothballed and left to crumble, despite numerous efforts of people like Derek and others to try to reopen it or find out what its current state of play is. And there are numerous instances like this. And I know Bernd is very interested, Bernd Keplinger from Germany, in this issue too. And he and I have shared a couple of thoughts about this, in terms of what's happening elsewhere in other parts of Europe as well, and perhaps some examples of new colleges emerging in other parts, certainly in some of the Scandinavian countries, which may give us some optimism if we can start thinking about, you know, perhaps how they've achieved it. So I'd just like to add a final point, really, that this is my research is kind of not done, not over. I want to look at these lost spaces, but not just as spaces that are lost, but how they can impact on the future. And Cilla and I are going to be taking a kind of forensic view on our own educational experiences, not in some kind of what's the word? Yes, sort of frivolous way, but to really try and inform on our understanding of how education shapes us, particularly from different class-based perspectives. So thank you very much. It's been an absolute privilege and pleasure, and thanks particularly to Cilla for that fantastic MC role that she played, and to all the speakers and contributors and people attending. I'm so very grateful to you, and I am astonished and ashamed to tell you that my book is a stupid price. Someone mentioned it in the chat, Wayne did, £110. It's not my fault. I'm just going to tell you that now straight out. I had nothing to do.
We won't be buying it at that, Sharon.
No, it's absolutely stupid. It is supposed to be coming out later this year as a paperback, but I have no idea what that will be in terms of cost. But I can just say it's not my fault.
PDFs are wonderful things.
Sharon,
thank you very much. I know people are leaving now, Sharon. Just to conclude, can I just, if we were all in a room, this is the advantage of residential, I would raise a glass, even at this time of the day, to say thank you for a brilliant book, for keeping these questions out there in the public domain, making sure that we all answer them and make our own. So thank you very much, Sharon, for a great book. And
could I say, Cilla, as somebody who was in at the beginning and there alongside all the way through, I hope that it's a brilliant product and well worthwhile. And I'm sorry about the price as editor of the series. I would add one other thing, which is that the price may have something to do with why the book is unfortunately not for sale at the Attingham shop of the National Trust, but I do rather think it should be, even at the astronomical price it is. And I don't know whether Sarah is still with us, but
Sarah's asked if she could say something for those of us still here. Please do, Sarah. Unmute. And I was just going to say, yeah, I have asked Sarah numerous times about the book being on sale. I'm not trying to put Sarah on the spot.
Hi, Sharon. Can you hear me all right?
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. Yes. As Sharon knows, the the arm of the National Trust that is NT Enterprises is sort of outside my control, unfortunately, because we often have this issue in inexplicable reasons that is sort of do with economies of return and things like that. But, you know, we will keep trying. But I just wanted to say quite a few things. I don't know how much, is there any time, Sharon, for me just to say a few things?
Just a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been making some notes all the way along. I mean, it's been really, really fascinating. And it just feels as though there's an ironic closer coming together now of the principles of the Adult Education College movement and Sir George's aspirations and aims, with finally, it feels like what the National Trust is aiming to do now with its places and bring them closer to the greater public. Because of course we deal with a lot of times these stately homes which were once the home of the privileged few but are now actually for the benefit of the nation, and that's our remit. It's for public benefit. And interestingly, the last Lord Berwick who gave Attingham to the National Trust, he stated for public benefit in his will, so we constantly remind ourselves of that. And the Trust is looking at inclusive histories, looking at public benefit, is trying to be now more audience-led, trying to make Attingham in particular, as part of our strategy, make it a living cultural resource for the people of Shropshire. And I feel all of our places are trying to do that in the areas where they are across the nation, wanting to decenter the stories of the aristocracy and the people who lived in them, wanting to bring in other voices, explore multiple perspectives, those with lived experiences, working in partnerships with those kinds of people so that it's not our voice, the National Trust voice or the previous owner's voice. We're also exploring ways in which, because as you know, we depend on our volunteers often for the interface with the public, wanting to explore ways in which we can foster a spirit of debate, philosophical inquiry. We talked about dialogue, having difficult conversations. All of those things are increasingly important, and making our places meaning and relevant to people today in things that people are struggling with in society and what's going on in the world. We talked about the dangers to the planet. We do that with our nature conservation work. So these feel like very, very much live issues for the Trust today, and probably more so than when the college was at Attingham and in the aftermath since its closure. So I feel there's maybe, hopefully, a more positive coming together and synergy of aims. And coming right up to Tom Woodin's point and the points now that John's been making about these provisions being closed down and the spaces no longer existing, that's what the Trust has. We have spaces. We could have or provide, and again, it's not within my gift, but we could have conversations at a higher level, alternative spaces for education. And we know that these spaces have power. They do have an impact on people. That's what Attingham demonstrated. You know, what are the opportunities for education? And we desperately want to bring in new people, younger people, people from different backgrounds. And so this coming together of these aims could be something that could work really well. So yeah, to finish is those calls about places that are closing down. Maybe there could be some brilliant synergy here. But as I say, it's not within my personal gift, but we could perhaps engineer some conversations at a higher level.
That'd be wonderful.
Very well made, Sarah.
That is really helpful, Sarah, and hopeful, Sarah. So, yeah, so maybe John and I could have a conversation with you at some point, and perhaps other people on the call. I'd be grateful for that. Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been fabulous, and I'm really glad Sarah managed to make those points at the end there, because I'd seen she'd wanted to speak before. So thank you so much to everybody for coming. I would be delighted to have those conversations on an ongoing basis. So we'll send some notes out. We'll remind people about the research circle events that are coming up. Well, the next one will be on workers' education, E.P. Thompson and Raymond Williams, which I think will be of interest to quite a lot of people. And the third one in October will be around the work of, well, particularly around the miners strike, but miners education community, actually. So delighted, and thank you so much to everyone for coming. It's made my absolute year. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Sharon, well done. Bye, everyone.